Section 17 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 4, Imperial Antiquity, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Theodosius the Great, Part 1. A.D. 346 to 395. The Latter Days of Rome. The last of those Roman emperors whom we call great was Theodosius. After him there is no great historic name, unless it be Justinian, who reigned when Rome had fallen. With Theodosius is associated the life and death struggle of Rome with the Gothic barbarians, and the final collapse of paganism as a tolerated religion. Paganism in its essence, its spirit, was not extinguished; it entered into new forms, even into the Church itself, and it still exists in Christian countries. When Bismarck was asked why he did not throw down his burdens, he is reported to have said, "Because no man can take my place. I should like to retire to my estates and raise cabbages. But I have work to do against paganism. I live among pagans." Neither Theodosius nor Bismarck was what we would call a saint. Both have been stained by acts which it is hard to distinguish from crimes, but both have given evidence of hatred of certain evils which undermine society. Theodosius especially made war and fought nobly against the two things which most imperilled the empire, the barbarians who had begun their ravages, and the paganism which existed both in and outside the Church. For which reasons he has been praised by most historians, in spite of great crimes and some vices. The worldly Gibbon admires him for the noble stand he took against eternal dangers, and the fathers of the Church almost adored him for his zealous efforts in behalf of orthodoxy. An eminent scholar of the advanced school has seen nothing in him to admire, and much to blame. But he was undoubtedly a very great man, and rendered important services to his age and to civilization, although he could not arrest the fatal disease which even then had destroyed the vitality of the empire. It was already doomed when he ascended the throne. No mortal genius, no imperial power could have saved the crumbling empire. In my lecture on Marcus Aurelius I alluded to the external prosperity and internal weakness of the old Roman world during his reign. That outward prosperity continued for a century after he was dead; that is, there were peace, thrift, art, wealth, and splendor. Men were unmolested in the pursuit of pleasure. There were no great wars with enemies beyond the limits of the empire. There were wars, of course, but these chiefly were civil wars between rival aspirants for imperial power, or to suppress rebellions, which did not alarm the people. They still sat under their own vines and fig trees, and danced to voluptuous music, and rejoiced in the glory of their palaces. They feasted and married and were given in marriage, like the antediluvians. They never dreamed that a great catastrophe was near, that great calamities were impending. I do not say that the people in that century were happy or contented, or even generally prosperous. How could they be happy or prosperous when monsters and tyrants sat on the throne of Augustus and Trajan? How could they be contented when there was such a vast inequality of condition, when slaves were more numerous than freemen, when most of the women were guarded and oppressed, when scarcely a man felt secure of the virtue of his wife, or a wife of the fidelity of her husband? When there was no relief from corroding sorrows but in the sports of the amphitheatre and circus, or some form of demoralizing excitement or public spectacle; when the great mass were ground down by poverty and insult, and the few who were rich and favored were satiated with pleasure, ennuied, and broken down by dissipation; when there was no hope in this world or in the next, no true consolation in sickness or in misfortune, except among the Christians, who fled by thousands to desert places to escape the contaminating vices of society. But if the people were not happy or fortunate as a general thing, they anticipated no overwhelming calamities. The outward signs of prosperity remained, all the glories of art, all the wonders of imperial and senatorial magnificence; the people were fed and amused at the expense of the state; the Colosseum was still daily crowded with its 87,000 spectators, and large hogs were still roasted whole at senatorial banquets, and wines were still drunk which had been stored 100 years. The dark-skinned daughters of Isis still sported unmolested in wanton mien with the priests of Cybele in their discordant cries. The streets were still filled with the worshippers of Bacchus and Venus, with barbaric captives and their Teuton priests, with chariots and horses, with richly apparelled young men and fashionable ladies in quest of new perfumes. The various places of amusement were still thronged with giddy youth and gouty old men who would have felt insulted had any one told them that the most precious thing they had was the most neglected. Everywhere, as in the time of Trajan, were unrestricted pleasures and unrestricted trades. What cared the shopkeepers and the carpenters and the bakers whether a Commodus or a Severus reigned? They were safe. It was only great nobles who were in danger of being robbed or killed by grasping emperors. The people on the whole lived for 100 years after the accession of Commodus as they did under Trajan and Marcus Aurelius. True, there had been great calamities during this 100 years. There had been terrible plagues and pestilences. In some of these as many as 5,000 people died daily in Rome alone. There were tumults and revolts. There were wars and massacres. There was often the reign of monsters or idiots. Yet even as late as the reign of Aurelian, 90 years after the death of Aurelius, the empire was thought to be eternal, nor was any triumph ever celebrated with greater pride and magnificence than his. And as the victorious emperor in his triumphal chariot marched along the Via Sacra up the Capitoline Hill, with the spoils and trophies of 100 battles, with ambassadors and captives, including Zenobia herself, fainting with the weight of jewels and golden fetters, it would seem that Rome was destined to overcome all the vicissitudes of nature, and reign as mistress of the world forever. But that century did not close until real dangers stared the people in the face, and so alarmed the guardians of the empire that they could no longer retire to their secluded villas for luxurious leisure, but were forced to perpetual warfare, and with foes they had hitherto despised. Two things marked the 100 years before the accession of Theodosius of especial historical importance: the successful inroads of barbarians carrying desolation and alarm to the very heart of the empire, and the wonderful spread of the Christian religion. Persecution ended with Diocletian, and under Constantine Christianity seated herself upon his throne. During this century of barbaric spoliations and public miseries, the desolation of provinces, the sack of cities, the ruin of works of art, the burning of palaces, all the unnumbered evils which universal war created, the converts to Christianity increased, for Christianity alone held out hope amid despair and ruin. The public dangers were so great that only successful generals were allowed to wear the imperial purple. The ablest men of the empire were at last summoned to govern it. From the year 286 to 394 most of the emperors were able men, and some were great and virtuous. Perhaps the empire was never more ably administered than was the Roman in the day of its calamities. Aurelian, Diocletian, Constantine, Theodosius are alike immortal. They all alike fought with the same enemies, and contended with the same evils. The enemies were the Gothic barbarians; the evils were the degeneracy and vices of Roman soldiers, which universal corruption had at last produced. It was a sad hour in the old capital of the world when its blinded inhabitants were aroused from the stupendous delusion that they were invincible; when the crushing fact blazed upon them that the legions had been beaten, that province after province had been overrun, that the proudest cities had fallen, that the barbarians were advancing, everywhere advancing, treading beneath their feet temples, palaces, statues, libraries, priceless works of art; that there was no shelter to which they could fly; that Rome herself was doomed. In the year 378 the Emperor Valens himself was slain, almost under the walls of his capital, with two-thirds of his army, some 60,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, while the victorious Goths, gorged with spoils, advanced to take possession of the defeated and crumbling empire. From the shores of the Bosporus to the Julian Alps nothing was seen but conflagration, murders, and depredations, and the cry of anguish went up to heaven in accents of almost universal despair. In such a crisis a great man was imperatively needed, and a great man arose. The dismayed emperor cast his eyes over the whole extent of his dominions to find a deliverer, and he found the needed hero living quietly and in modest retirement on a farm in Spain. This man was Theodosius the Great, a young man then, as modest as David amid the pastures, as unambitious as Cincinnatus at the plough. The vulgar, says Gibbon, gazed with admiration on the manly beauty of his face and the graceful majesty of his person, while in the qualities of his mind and heart intelligent observers perceived the blended excellences of Trajan and Constantine. as prudent as Fabius, as persevering as Alfred, as comprehensive as Charlemagne, as full of resources as Frederick II, no more fitting person could be found to wield the sceptre of Trajan his ancestor. No greater man than he did the Empire then contain, and Gratian was wise and fortunate in associating with himself so illustrious a man in the imperial dignity. If Theodosius was unassuming, he was not obscure and unimportant. His father had been a successful general in Britain and Africa, and he himself had been instructed by his father in the art of war, and had served under him with distinction. As Duke of Maesia, he had vanquished an army of Sarmatians, saved the province, deserved the love of his soldiers, and provoked the envy of the court. But his father having incurred the jealousy of Gratian and been unjustly executed, he was allowed to retire to his patrimonial estates near Valladolid, where he gave himself up to rural enjoyments and ennobling studies. He was not long permitted to remain in this retirement, for the public dangers demanded the service of the ablest general in the empire, and there was none so illustrious as he. And how lofty must have been his character if Gratian dared to associate with himself in the government of the empire a man whose father he had unjustly executed. He was 33 when he was invested with imperial purple and entrusted with the conduct of the Gothic war. The Goths, who under Fritigern had defeated the Roman army before the walls of Adrianople, were Germanic barbarians who lived between the Rhine and the Vistula in those forests which now form the Empire of Germany. They belonged to a family of nations which had the same natural characteristics: love of independence, passion for war, veneration for women, and religious tendency of mind. They were brave, persevering, bold, hardy, and virtuous, for barbarians. They cast their eyes on the Roman provinces in the time of Marius, and were defeated by him under the name of Teutons. They had recovered strength when Caesar conquered the Gauls. They were very formidable in the time of Marcus Aurelius, and had formed a general union for the invasion of the Roman world. But a barrier had been made against their incursions by those good and warlike emperors who preceded Commodus, so that the Romans had peace for 100 years. These barbarians went under different names, which I will not enumerate, different tribes of the same Germanic family, whose remote ancestors lived in Central Asia, and were kindred to the Medes and Persians. Like the early inhabitants of Greece and Italy, they were of the Aryan race. All the members of this great family, in their early history, had the same virtues and vices. They worshipped the forces of nature, recognizing behind these a supreme and superintending deity, whose wrath they sought to deprecate by sacrifices. They set a great value on personal independence, and hence had great individuality of character. They delighted in the pleasures of the chase. They were generally temperate and chaste. They were superstitious, social, and quarrelsome, bent on conquest, and migrated from country to country with a view of improving their fortunes. The Goths were the first of these barbarians who signally triumphed over the Roman arms. Starting from their home in the Scandinavian peninsula, they pressed upon the Slavic population of the Vistula, and by rapid conquests established themselves in southern and eastern Germany. Here they divided. The Visi, or West Goths, advanced to the Danube. In the reign of Decius, 249 to 251, they crossed the river and ravaged the Roman territory. In 269 they imposed a tribute on the Emperor Gratian, and seem to have been settled in Dacia. After this they made several successful raids, invading Bithynia, entering the Propontis, and advancing as far as Athens and Corinth, even to the coasts of Asia Minor, destroying in their ravages the temple of Diana at Ephesus, with its 127 marble columns. These calamities happened in the middle of the 3rd century, during the reign of the frivolous Gallienus, who received the news with his accustomed indifference. While the Goths were burning the Grecian cities, this royal cook and gardener was soliciting a place in the Areopagus of Athens. In the reign of Claudius, the barbarians united under the Gothic standard, and in 6,000 vessels prepared again to ravage the world. Against 320,000 of these Goths Claudius advanced, and defeated them at Naissus in Dalmatia. 50,000 were slain, and 3 Gothic women fell to the share of every soldier. On the return of spring, nothing of that mighty host was seen. Aurelian, who succeeded Claudius, and whose father had been a peasant of Sirmium, put an end to the Gothic war, and the empire again breathed, but only for a time, for the barbarians continually advanced, although they were continually beaten by the warlike emperors who succeeded Gallienus. In the middle of the 3rd century they were firmly settled in Dacia by permission of Valerian. 100 years after, pressed by Huns, they asked for lands south of the Danube, which request was granted by Valens; but they were rudely treated by the Roman officials, especially their women, and treachery was added to their other wrongs. Filled with indignation, they made a combination and swept everything before them, plundering cities and sparing neither age nor sex. These ravages continued for a year. Valens, aroused, advanced against them, and was slain in the memorable battle on the plains of Adrianople, 9th of August, 378, the most disastrous since the battle of Cannae, and from which the empire never recovered. To save the crumbling world, Theodosius was now made associate emperor; and in that great crisis prudence was more necessary than valor. No Roman army at that time could contend openly in the field, face to face, with the conquering hordes who assembled under the standard of Fritigern, the first historic name among the Visigoths. Theodosius fixed his headquarters at Thessalonica, from whence he could watch the irregular actions of the barbarians and direct the movements of his lieutenants. He strengthened his defences and fortifications, from which his soldiers made frequent sallies, as Alfred did against the Danes, and accustomed themselves to the warfare of their most dangerous enemies. He pursued the same policy that Fabius did after the battle of Cannae, to whose wisdom the Romans perhaps were more indebted for their ultimate success than to the brilliant exploits of Scipio. The death of Fritigern, the great predecessor of Alaric, relieved Theodosius from many anxieties, for it was followed by the dissension and discord of the barbarians themselves, by improvidence and the disorderly movements, and when the Goths were once more united under Anatharic, Theodosius succeeded in making an honorable treaty with him, and in entertaining him with princely hospitalities in his capital, whose glories alike astounded and bewildered him. Temperance was not one of the virtues of Gothic kings under strong temptation, and Athanaric, yielding to the force of banquets and imperial seductions, soon after died. The politic emperor gave his late guest a magnificent funeral, and erected to his memory a stately monument which won the favor of the Goths, and for a time converted them to allies. In 4 years the entire capitulation of the Visigoths was effected. Theodosius then turned his attention to the Ostro or East Goths, who advanced, with other barbarians, to the banks of the lower Danube, on the Thracian frontier. Allured to cross the river in the night, the barbarians found a triple line of Roman war vessels chained to each other in the middle of the river, which offered an effectual resistance to their 6,000 canoes, and they perished with their king. Having gradually vanquished the most dangerous enemies of the empire, Theodosius had been censured for allowing them to settle in the provinces they had desolated, and still more for incorporating 50,000 of their warriors in the imperial armies, since they were more secret enemies, and would burst through their limits whenever an opportunity offered. But they were really too formidable to be driven back beyond the frontiers of the crumbling empire. Theodosius could only procure a period of peace, and this was not to be secured save by adroit flatteries. The day was past for the extermination of the Goths by the Roman soldiers, who had already thrown away their defensive armor, nor was it possible that they would amalgamate with the people of the empire, as the Celtic barbarians had done in Spain and Gaul after the victories of Caesar. Though the kingly power was taken away from them, and they fought bravely under the imperial standards, it was evident from their insolence and their contempt of the effeminate masters that the day was not distant when they would be the conquerors of the empire. It does not speak well for an empire that it is held together by the virtues and abilities of a single man. Nor could the fate of the Roman Empire be doubtful when barbarians were allowed to settle in its provinces, for after the death of Valens the Goths never abandoned the Roman territory. They took possession of Thrace, as Saxons and Danes took possession of England. After the conciliation of the Goths, for we cannot call it the conquest, Theodosius was obliged to turn his attention to the affairs of the Western Empire, for he ruled only the eastern provinces. It would seem that Gratian, who had called him to his assistance to preserve the East from the barbarians, was now in trouble in the West. He had not fulfilled the great expectation that had been formed of him. He degraded himself in the eyes of the Romans by his absorbing passion for the pleasures of the chase, while public affairs imperatively demanded his attention. He received a body of Alans into the military and domestic service of the palace. He was indolent and pleasure-seeking, but was awakened from his inglorious sports by a revolt in Britain. Maximus, a native of Spain and governor of the island, had been proclaimed emperor by his soldiers. He invaded Gaul with a large fleet and army, followed by the youth of Britain, and was received with acclamations by the armies of that province. Gratian, then residing in Paris, fled to Lyons, deserted by his troops, and was assassinated by the orders of Maximus. The usurper was now acknowledged by the western provinces as emperor, and was too powerful to be resisted at that time by Theodosius, who accepted his ambassadors and made a treaty with the usurper by which he was permitted to reign over Britain, Gaul, and Spain, provided that the other western provinces, including Wales, should accept and acknowledge Valentinian, the brother of the murdered Gratian, who was however a mere boy, and was ruled by his mother Justina, an Arian, that celebrated woman who quarrelled with Ambrose, Archbishop of Milan. Valentinian was even more feeble than Gratian, and Maximus, not contented with the sovereignty of the three most important provinces of the empire, resolved to reign over the entire West. Theodosius, who had dissembled his anger and waited for opportunity, now advanced to the relief of Valentinian, who had been obliged to fly from Milan, the seat of his power. But in 2 months Theodosius subdued his rival, who fled to Italy, only, however, to be dragged from the throne and executed. Having terminated the civil war, and after a short residence in Milan, Theodosius made his triumphal entry into the ancient capital of the world. He was now the absolute and undisputed master of the East and the West, as Constantine had been, whom he resembled in his military genius and executive ability. But he gave to Valentinian, a youth of 20, murdered a few months after, the provinces of Italy and Illyria, and entrusted Gaul to the care of Arbogastes, a gallant soldier among the Franks, who, like Maximus, aspired to reign. But power was dearer to the valiant Frank than a name, and he made his creature, the rhetorician Eugenius, the nominal emperor of the West. Hence another civil war, but this more serious than the last, and for which Theodosius was obliged to make 2 years' preparation. The contest was desperate. Victory at one time seemed to be even on the side of Arbogastes. Theodosius was obliged to retire to the hills on the confines of Italy, apparently subdued, when, in the utmost extremity of danger, a desertion of troops from the army of the triumphant barbarian again gave him the advantage, and the bloody and desperate battle on the banks of the Frigidus reestablished Theodosius as the supreme ruler of the world. Both Arbogastes and Eugenius were slain, and the East and West were once more, and for the last time, united. The division of the empire under Diocletian had not proved a wise policy, but was perhaps necessary, since only a Hercules could have borne the burdens of undivided sovereignty in an age of turbulence, treason, revolts, and anarchies. It was probably much easier for Tiberius or Trajan to rule the whole world than for one of the later emperors to rule a province. Alfred had a harder task than Charlemagne, and Queen Elizabeth than Queen Victoria. I have dwelt very briefly on those contests in which the great Theodosius was obliged to fight for his crown and for the empire. For a time he had delivered the citizens from the fear of the Goths, and had reestablished the imperial sovereignty over the various provinces. But only for a time. The external dangers reappeared at his death. He only averted impending ruin; he only propped up a crumbling empire. No human genius could have long prevented the fall. Hence his struggles with the barbarians and with the rebels have no deep interest to us. We associate with his reign something more important than these outward conflicts. Civilization at large owes him a great debt for labors in another field, for which he is most truly immortal, for which his name is treasured by the Church, for which he was one of the greatest benefactors. These labors were directed to the improvement of jurisprudence, and the final extinction of paganism as a tolerated religion. He gave to the Church and to Christianity a new prestige. He rooted out, so far as genius and authority can, those heresies which were rapidly assimilating the new religion to the old. He was the friend and patron of those great ecclesiastics whose names are consecrated. The great Ambrose was his special friend, in whose arms he expired. Augustine, Martin of Tours, Jerome, Gregory Nazianzen, Basil, Chrysostom, Damasus were all contemporaries, or nearly so. In his day the Church was really seated on the high places of the earth. A bishop was a greater man than a senator. He exercised more influence and had more dignity than a general. He was ambassador, courtier, and statesman, as well as prelate. Theodosius handed over to the Church the government of mankind. To him we date that ecclesiastical government which was perfected by Charlemagne, and which was dominant in the Middle Ages. Anarchy and misery spread over the world, but the new barbaric forces were obedient to the officers of the Church. The Church looms up in the days of Theodosius as the great power of the world. End of section 17.